We do have our next guest with us, Congressman Fred Grandy, who served 4 consecutive terms in the House of Representatives, but he was also known as Gopher by millions of fans around the world who watched him for 9 years in the series The Love Boat. Congressman Grandy also served as the president and CEO for Goodwill Industries. Congressman Grandy was also a political commentator on National Public Radio and the host of the talk show on WMAL Morning News. Congressman Grandy, welcome back to the Conservative Commandos radio show.
Nice to be here.
We appreciate you spending a little time with us. Congressman Grandy, I ask you to join us today to talk with us about things that are in the news, in particular in Egypt. There's news that says the judges in Egypt are engaged in a war of words with President Morsi's attempt to reinstate the Egyptian parliament, which had been dissolved by the then-ruling military council. What does this mean, and can you please tell us what's going on in Egypt between the newly elected president, the parliament, and the military? Who is in charge?
Well, the short answer to that is the once and future ruler of Egypt is Mohammed Tantawi, who is the chairman of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. He is the guy that occasionally will show up in Washington on Capitol Hill trying to get money for the Egyptian military. And, of course, he usually succeeds because last year we gave them $1.5 billion without strings, despite the fact that Congress tried to attach some. And he is usually escorted around to these meetings by members of our own CENTCOM, of our own military. So Tantawi is the power behind the throne. And everything that you've seen with Mohammed Morsi and the elections of the Muslim Brotherhood are a form of theatrics, but it is, to some degree, smoke and mirrors. You've got an Islamist president. You've got the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power, and you have these various other parties, Salafist parties, and this party Building and Development, which is really the legitimate political name for a terrorist group, Gamal al-Islamiyah. But the bottom line is nobody does anything without the express approval of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. That's the way it was under Mubarak. That's the way it was under Anwar Sadat. That's the way it was under Abdel Nasser. That's the way it's been pretty much since 1952. And unless there's another upheaval, and by that I mean a popular revolt that is more legitimate than the one we saw in Tahrir Square a little over a year ago, that's the way it's going to remain.
Is that good for the United States or not?
Well, that's really the most important question. Because what I think, and now I'm speculating, but I think this is the way power sharing will evolve. The military will continue to control the economy, which, by the way, it has always controlled and has a lion's share of. And that means that they will continue to lobby for foreign aid and probably get it with very few strings. And they will also control, obviously, all foreign policy, and by that I mean they would probably hold the Camp David Accords at least in some kind of abeyance. I don't think they will publicly dismantle them. But I think what they will cede to the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi and whoever he appoints in his cabinet is an agenda that is pretty much what I guess I would call cultural, educational, and religious issues, which means that I think they will allow much more Sharia law to take effect in Egypt than has been the case up to this point. I think there will be probably much more persecution of religious minorities, whether we're talking about non-Muslims or Christians. I don't think this bodes well for women in Egypt. But I want to read something to you that not a lot of people know about. But on June 17th, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces issued a constitutional declaration. Now, just think about that for a minute. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces issued a constitutional declaration. Try applying that to American society. When was the last time the American military issued a constitutional declaration? But anyway, that's what's going on. And here's essentially what they said. The president can issue a decision to direct the armed forces with the approval of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to maintain security and defend public properties. That is a blanket designation for martial law whenever SCAF approves it. That's essentially what they have in place right now. So they have a shadow government, supposedly a duly elected president, and a legitimate party, if you consider the Muslim Brotherhood to be a legitimate party. But what they really still have is very much of a military dictatorship pulling the strings behind the scenes. Now, one of the dividends that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces gets from this, of course, is that with supposedly Mohammed Morsi, among other things, being invited to the White House, as the Obama administration has already done, and looking like the legitimate, duly elected ruler of Egypt, if the economy of Egypt collapses, which it is perilously close to doing, it will be Mohammed Morsi's fault and not the military, because everybody will assume, well, obviously the president and the Muslim Brotherhood took over the government, and so the economy has collapsed on their watch. So to some degree, they have instituted a scapegoat which could keep them in power even longer if the Muslim Brotherhood should crash and burn once it assumes the reins of government.
Congressman, in connection with that, CNN reported today that Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, inhabited by about 30 Bedouin tribes, has long been in a lawless land that serves as a buffer between Egypt and Israel. But there's now more tensions in that area because there is Egypt's post-revolution security vacuum. By increasingly engaged, this area is being infested with drug traffic, arms smuggling, human traffic, and terrorism.
Absolutely.
And that the escalating lawlessness of the Sinai is turning the region to a powder keg. Now, also, Reuters reported today that Israel is deploying rocket interceptors at the Egyptian border. Now, I bring these two items up because when you're talking about the Egyptian economy, in the past, before the Egyptian Spring, the Egyptian economy was based on two factors. One was tourism. However, Egypt's biggest money maker is the Suez Canal. Now, what borders the Suez Canal but the Sinai Peninsula? Absolutely. So there seems to be a building up like a volcano that soon enough there's going to be an eruption there that's going to devastate the Egyptian economy because tourism, since the Egyptian Spring has gone down the tubes, and as I said, their biggest money maker is the Suez Canal. That'll probably be blocked and closed. Am I wrong here in building these different scenarios?
I'm not sure. I doubt very seriously, SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, would close the Suez Canal if they receive pressure from the Islamists and Salafist groups. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you hear in Iran when they're talking about closing the Strait of Hormuz, and you probably also heard these rumors that there is pressure now to destroy the pyramids because they are essentially the vestige of an infidel culture that preexisted in Egypt before the Muslims arrived in 640 or whenever it was. And I think this is the kind of stuff that makes for dicey radio talk, but I cannot believe the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which is looking as seriously at these economic numbers as you are, is going to say, all right, we really have two ways to generate money in this country. One is people coming here to look at the pyramids, and the other is the Suez Canal to allow trade and commercial vessels to pass through to the Mediterranean Sea. So unless the military were overthrown, which I think is highly unlikely, I think those two things are going to stay in place. But I want to go back to what you said about the Sinai, because your observation about the Sinai is spot on. The Sinai is largely no man's land, and that's why the Israelis have built a fence from Eilat, which of course is their port at the bottom of the peninsula, all the way up to Gaza, because they do not want arms traffic, whether it's Hamas or Bedouin tribes or anybody who's dealing drugs and guns to get into Israel. And at the same time, they don't want missiles or grenades fired into Israel as well, and we know that's going on. So when I say that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces will maintain the vestige of diplomacy with Israel, that's not to say that they won't continue to fire up the rhetoric about destroying Israel, which you hear now in Cairo as well as Tehran, and it's also not to say that they won't continue these kinds of asymmetric assaults with weapons or with terrorist groups or with the kinds of guerrilla-type tactics that we've already seen, and the Sinai is the perfect place for that because, as you pointed out, it's largely populated by Bedouin tribes who can easily be co-opted for this kind of work.
We're speaking with Congressman Fred Grandy, and Congressman Grandy is also Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Congressman Grandy, on the other end of the line is my co-host, Anna Little. Anna, do you have any questions for Congressman Fred Grandy?
Good afternoon, Congressman. I wonder as I read this article that, we've got 50% of the parliament controlled by Islamists. We've got an Islamist president. And you've got the military who has disbanded the parliament in Egypt. And then the president's ordering the parliament back to work over the military having disbanded it. And they're all Muslim. So can you explain a little bit of this dichotomy, perhaps, or maybe it's all part of a plan? I don't know.
Well, it is. I think it is, to some degree, a large political theater. Because, as you recall, what happened at the beginning of this week, Mohammed Morsi said, I'm going to reconvene the parliament. I am going to seat these duly elected parliamentarians. And, of course, the Supreme Constitutional Court had already said they're not duly elected, so they can't seat.
Right.
And what happened is they did have a session, but they only had a session for about an hour. We would call that in our Congress a pro forma session, where they didn't really conduct any business. They just kind of gaveled everybody into order and then talked and left. And to my knowledge, there has been no real business that has been conducted by the Egyptian parliament. So to some degree, Morsi and his colleagues are pushing the envelope a little bit, but I think the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces has successfully pushed back. Now, what I think they will agree to is some kind of compromise, and they will be allowed to perhaps conduct some business until the next election, which I believe will happen within the next year, where they will have another parliamentary election, and a lot of these guys that were elected before will have to stand. But I also would like to point out that we know, because we have sources in Egypt and people that report to us on what's happening and is reported on some of the Arabic news services that you don't see here, is that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, who is still the guy they proposed for president, a guy named Khairat al-Shatter, who had to withdraw from the race because he apparently he had an American wife or something like that. There was something that disqualified him, and then they found this guy, Mohammed Morsi, and put him up for election. Al-Shatter is still the head of the party. And apparently there was a meeting between SCAF and al-Shatter that allowed Morsi to become the president, but would allow SCAF to continue their capacity as the principal seat of governance for the state. Knowing that, I think all of this back and forth about the parliament is, to a large degree, for the benefit of Western media, and to some degree for the Egyptian people who are trying to figure out whether they elected a democracy or just the same circus in a different tent. And quite honestly, that, I think, is what Egyptian news services and people writing in Arabic are really saying about the election. I've got a couple of journalistic quotes here. One guy who is a pretty prominent Egyptian journalist named Zainab Abu El-Magid says political coups these days are done through, quote-unquote, fair elections. And a lot of people refer to this election as a military coup. They refer to Morsi as a president without power. And apparently one Islamist compared him to Queen Elizabeth, which means he reigns, but he doesn't rule. So that's kind of what the attitude is in country. Those of us who want democracy to flourish in this part of the world are going to, I think, attach as rosy a scenario as our imaginations will allow, the facts notwithstanding. And that's what we're looking at right now.
So, again, I'm not sure whether this is some kind of conflict, which it seems it could not be, possibly, or if it is some kind of a plan. So we'll have to watch it play out, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm afraid we'll all have to watch out. But I think right now we essentially have a variation on the old government wearing supposedly a new democratic attire. I really think what we're looking at right now is the emperor has no clothes, but just new clothes.
Right. Congressman Grandy, I want to get back to for a minute. We only have a few minutes left in this segment, but I think this is important that we talk about getting back to the Sinai. Since Egypt's post-revolution security vacuum, in the Sinai with the arms smuggling, human trafficking, and the terrorism taking place in the Sinai, and you've got the Egyptians stepping up by deploying missile interceptors at the Egyptian border. In addition to the situation, the Israelis, yes, are deploying interceptors at the Egyptian border. But in addition to the situation that we've been talking about, are the Palestinians also taking advantage of this unrest in this situation to promote their goals?
Oh, absolutely.
And how does that influence the situation in Egypt?
The big winners in all of these so-called elections, whether we're talking about Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, is Hamas. I say Hamas because I think they are probably the power in Gaza right now, and certainly in the West Bank, even though supposedly we would like to think there's some kind of power-sharing agreement between them and Fatah. But sure, and among other things, they received $147 million from the United States, courtesy of the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. So one of my concerns, and this I'm just speaking for myself right now, but if the Muslim Brotherhood becomes a legitimate entity and a governing entity, rather than the kind of mothership from which terrorist organizations like Hamas and Al-Qaeda and Jamaat al-Islamiyah spawn, then what's to keep a future Obama administration, assuming they're reelected, from saying, all right, we no longer consider Hamas a foreign terrorist organization, and we will legitimate them because they've now adopted peaceful, transitional, governmental solutions as opposed to terrorism.
The time is now for
just like the IRA when they became Sinn Féin. That's what I think is in the back of their minds at the State Department.
Wow. Well, Congressman Fred Grandy, we want to thank you for joining us today on the Conservative Commandos radio show. Before you go, please give us your websites at the Center for Security Policy.
Yep, it's it's securefreedom.org, and that I also would recommend. We've got a course on the Muslim Brotherhood called Muslim Brotherhood in America.com, which I think would be very interesting to most of your listeners.
Okay, we'll check him out. Again, Congressman Fred Grandy, thank you so much for joining us today on the Conservative Commandos radio show. We always enjoy the time that you spend with us. You're always so generous with your time, and we want to thank you so very much.
You're welcome.